The Book of Daniel, a reflection. Daniel and the Kings of Babylon, Daniel 1 verses 1 to Daniel 6 verses 29. The first section of the Book of Daniel is a collection of 6 independent, edifying short stories about Daniel and his companions. Daniel possessed the power to interpret dreams and visions. These chapters raise troublesome questions: the date of composition, unity of authorship, and original language of the Book of Daniel. The scholars agree that this book is a work of more than one author. Chapter 1 to 6 employ a common folklore plot of the success of the uncompromising wise courtier, thus contain a message for those who are living in oppression. This book is written in 3 languages. Chapters 1 to 2, verse 4 in Hebrew. It shifts to Aramaic from 2 verse 4 to chapter 7 verse 28, and then back to Hebrew chapter 8 verse 1 to chapter 12 verse 13, and then Greek. This book has a whole religious tract written to encourage people faced with difficult choices. The opening chapters were likely told to encourage the Jewish people to stand firm in the midst of alien pressures, as Daniel and his friends had done. Told first most likely in the 3rd BCE and then retold in the 2nd century BCE by the author who gave shape to the final proto-canonical text in chapters 1 to 12. This book is neither a book of prophecy nor like any of the books in the writings. It is only apocalypse in the Old Testament. This book is the only book written in Hebrew, Aramaic as well as Greek. The last chapters of the longer book of Daniel are in Greek. This book is probably the most important book of the Old Testament theologically for Jesus to see his own self-identity as the Son of Man in Daniel 7. Recruiting Daniel and other young men into royal service, Daniel chapter 1 verses 1 to 7. The first story introduces Daniel and his companions and tells us of their training in the Nebuchadnezzar's court and recounts their struggle with the compromises required by life in a foreign culture, particularly the dilemma involved to eat and drink ritually impure food. Daniel, my judge is God, also called Belteshazzar, protect his life. Hananiah, Yahweh is gracious, also Shadrach, meaning is not clear. Mishael, who belongs to God, also Mishak, meaning is not clear. Azariah, the Yahweh has helped, also Abednego, servant of Nego. Verses 1 and 2 set the story in Babylon in the year 606 BCE. These young men's fidelity to the Jewish dietary law, Daniel 1 verses 8 to 16. They were forced to eat pork against their dietary laws in Leviticus 11 1, 1 Maccabees 1 62-63, 2 Maccabees 6 verse 18, and 7 verse 1. Young Jews refused to eat food offered by the king and insisted on eating vegetables only, and as a reward for their fidelity to the dietary laws, God makes the young Jews fatter and wiser. Yahweh blessing the young men with great wisdom, Daniel 1 verses 17 to 21. God rewards the faithfulness of the foe by granting them such success that at the end of their time of training, the king finds them 10 times more knowledgeable than anyone in Babylonia. They enter the king's service. For these 4 youth, loyalty to the Lord is rewarded with success in the foreign court. The king's dream, Daniel 2 verses 1 to 49. God discloses to Daniel mysteries not known to others or Nebuchadnezzar's service. Nebuchadnezzar commands that they tell both the dream and its meaning or they will die in verse 6. 4. Pray for deliverance from the God of heaven, verse 18. Their prayer is answered during a nocturnal vision in which God reveals the mystery of the king's dream to Daniel, verse 19. The third and the final episode, in verse 24 to 45, Daniel tells the king both the dream and its interpretation. It speaks about the demise of the 4 successive empires. Head of the statue made of gold represented Babylon, chest and arms made of silver represented Media. The belly and the thighs made of bronze represented Persia. The legs made of iron represented Greece. The feet made of iron represented Alexander's divided empire. Nebuchadnezzar falls at Daniel's feet and worships him, readily acknowledges the superiority of Daniel's God and rewards him for his great display of wisdom in telling the dream and its interpretation. Nebuchadnezzar promotes him to the highest office in the kingdom. The chapter closes with the note that Daniel requests administrative posts in the province for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, while he himself remains at the king's court. Daniel 3 verses 1 to 97, the fiery furnace. The first story is a dramatic contest about the identity of the true God, in which Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego show their willingness to suffer death rather than worship a God other than the God of Israel. Daniel plays no part in this story of the fiery furnace. His brush with martyrdom occurs in the lion's den in chapter 6. Nebuchadnezzar has set up a huge golden statue. All are required to bow down and worship the golden statue or be cast into a white hot furnace. Refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's furnace is heated up 7 times more. 7 is used as a symbol of fullness and totality. The three walk about in the flame, singing to God and blessing the Lord in verse 24. Nebuchadnezzar is astonished to hear the singing and bewildered at seeing 4 men in the midst of the flames. He calls Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego out. He blesses their God for sending them an angel of deliverance and decrees that any person who blasphemes the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will be cut to pieces. They are promoted. A vision of the great tree, Daniel 3 verses 98 to Daniel 4 verses 34. The fourth story is written in the form of a testimonial letter from Nebuchadnezzar to his subjects. Nebuchadnezzar conveys that the God of the Jews governs all human kingdoms and determines who will rule them. The king of Babylon recounts a lesson in humility taught him by the king of heaven, chapter 4 verse 34. Daniel figures only in the story dealing with the interpretation of the king's dream from chapter 4 verses 1 to 24. Daniel explains to Nebuchadnezzar the dream is related to him. He invites Nebuchadnezzar to atone for his sins by good deeds and thus avoid punishment. Things happen as explained by Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar, at the end of the 7 years of punishment, his health, sense and kingdom were restored and he blesses the Most High. Nebuchadnezzar closes his letter by explaining that he now praises and exalts the King of Heaven because all his works are right and his ways just. In this story, acknowledgement of the Lord brings health and prosperity to a foreign king. Daniel 5 verses 1 to 6 verses 1, the writing on the wall. The fifth story is a simple one-scene mystery story about a swiftly punished sacrilege committed by King Belshazzar. Belshazzar called for the sacred gold and silver vessels from Jerusalem temple and uses them, toasts the Babylonian gods and praises his gods. His desecration is dramatically halted when a human finger unattached to a body appears and writes a mysterious message on the wall. No one can interpret it. The queen suggests Daniel's name. Daniel refuses the reward and delivers a brief homily on humility the Most High had taught Nebuchadnezzar. He accuses Belshazzar of rebelling against the Lord of heaven by profaning the temple objects and declares that the writing translates as a divine declaration of the end of the Babylonian Empire. Daniel's wisdom is displayed and a foreign king is eliminated for failing to respect God's sovereignty. Daniel 6 verses 2 to 29 in the lion's den. The sixth story is a dramatic test of loyalty involving King Darius, Daniel and officials. Daniel is a supervisor of 120 provinces and is entrapped by the jealous court rivals who get the king issue an immutable, irrevocable decree that for 30 days anyone who petitions a god or a person will be cast into the den of lions. Daniel continues his customary practices of prayer. 3 times a day, kneels in prayer. Officials catch Daniel offering his petitions to God and hand him over to King Darius, who reluctantly sentences Daniel to the lion's den. Before sealing the den, the king says, "May your God, whom you serve so constantly, save you." Darius, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, save you from the lions." Daniel, "O king, live forever. My God has sent his angel and closed the lions' mouths." Darius sends an edict, verse 26 to 28, throughout his kingdom, testifying to the power and the sovereignty of the living God of Daniel. Part 2, Daniel's Vision, the Apocalyptic. In the series of 4 visions concerning the course of the world history, Daniel is not the interpreter of the mysteries, but rather the recipient of sacred revelations in chapters 9, 10, 11 and 12. Through the mediation of angels, it is revealed that in the immediate future, God will judge and destroy Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Daniel 7 verses 1 to 28 is a vision of the 4 beasts. This dream tells of a mysterious symbolic vision in verse 1 to 14 and its interpretation verses 15 to 28, which were revealed to Daniel in the first year of King Belshazzar of Babylon. The 4 horrible evil beasts, a lion with eagle wings, a 3-fanged animal like a ravenous bear, and a 4-winged, 4-headed animal like a leopard, and a 10-horned ravaging beast with a great iron teeth and a rampling feet. Daniel is told that these 4 beasts symbolize the 4 kingdoms over which the holy people of the Most High will triumphantly rule. Verse 17 and 18, that is Babylon, Media, Persia and Greece. Compare this with chapter 2. The 10 horns of the fourth beast represent the divided Greek empire of Alexander the Great, and the blasphemous little horn represents the ruler Antiochus IV Epiphanes. The angel assures Daniel that though the little horn was against the holy ones, its triumph will be brief. Dominion over it will soon be given to the holy ones of Israel in verse 19 to 27. The Son of Man here represents God's own people to whom victory will be given in the immediate future, verse 27. Daniel records that the dream vision ended and that he kept what he had seen to himself because he was terrified, in verse 28. Daniel 8 verses 1 to 27, the vision of the ram and the he-goat. Written in Hebrew, this vision tells of a battle between a two-horned ram representing the Medo-Persian Empire and a he-goat, that is Alexander the Great. He-goat easily defeats the two-horned ram, Alexander's defeat of Persia. At the height of he-goat's power, its great unicorn is broken off and reference to Alexander's early death, and four horns sprout in its place, symbol of the four areas into which Alexander's kingdom was divided, that is Macedonia, Asia Minor, Syria, Babylonia and Egypt. They were ruled by four commanders. One of the horns sprouts its own little horn, verse 9, that is Antiochus IV Epiphanes, one of the commanders. This little horn attacks earthly and heavenly powers, coming into combat with the prince of the host and desecrating the temple. Daniel 9 verses 1 to 27, Gabriel and the 70 weeks. In this part, Daniel intercedes for the people like Moses in Exodus atones for the sins of the people. God answers Daniel's prayers and God forgives. The third vision concerns the end of time, is a direct revelation to Daniel through the mediation of angel Gabriel in chapter 8. This chapter is divided into two parts, Daniel's prayer in verse 3 to 19 and God's answer as delivered by Gabriel in verse 20 to 27. Daniel observes penance and fast. Fasting is an appropriate way to prepare for a revelation, as in 10:2-3 and Exodus 34:28. He offers prayers that opens with a frank confession of the disobedient sinfulness of the covenant people. It recalls God's graciousness in leading the people out of Egypt and God's justice in punishing Jerusalem. He petitions God to deliver the holy city and the nation that bears God's name. A threefold request summarizes and concludes the prayer. O Lord, hear, O Lord, pardon, O Lord, be attentive, and act without delay for your own sake. Answer to Daniel's prayer is Gabriel's message from God to instruct Daniel on the meaning of Jeremiah's prophecy in verse 20 to 27. The cherubim had two wings, as in Exodus 25:20. The seraphim had 6 wings. See Isaiah 6 verse 2. But Gabriel is the first angel to travel by wings in the Old Testament. Other angels simply appear. Daniel is given a reinterpretation of the scripture. He is told not 70 years but 70 weeks of years, equal to 490 years must pass before the desolation will come to an end. So there will be 4 empires who will reign during this time. The 4th empire will be the Roman Empire. Daniel 10:1 to Daniel 12 verse 13 is a vision of the Hellenistic wars. The fourth and the final vision divides into 3 parts. Firstly, a lengthy introduction describing the appearance of God's emissary to Daniel and their conversation in chapter 10. Second is a revelation that rehearses the history of the relationship between Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in Syria, and ends with the death of Antiochus in 11 to 12 verse 4. And then we have a third part, an epilogue that closes with the sealing of God's secrets until the end of time, chapter 12 verses 5 to 13. Chapters 10 to 12, which are actually a historical retrospective written in the form of prophecy, were most likely composed shortly before the death of Antiochus in 163 BCE. These are apocalyptic chapters of the Bible regarding the past, present and future. Daniel is very submissive, ever ready to listen, because he knows he is weak and God is strong. When we compare it with Genesis 33, Jacob is wrestling with God. Here, Daniel is with God. Daniel is a model to imitate for us. Chapter 10 finds Daniel on the banks of the Tigris River following a 3-week period of penance and fasting. Daniel is granted a revelation. A heavenly emissary appears to him on the 24th day of the first month. Described in language reminiscent of Ezekiel, the angel interpreter, a gleaning man dressed in linen with a belt of fine gold around his waist, is seen only by Daniel, who faints at the sight in verse 7 to 9. Those who are with Daniel feel the terror. In verse 9 to 14, the angel raises Daniel to his knees, addresses him as beloved, and urges him to stand up and hear the message the angel has been sent to speak. Compared with Ezekiel chapter 2 verses 1. The dialogue between Daniel and the angel. Daniel is revealed what is yet to come in the future. The angel reveals that he has come to tell Daniel what will happen to Israel in the days to come, verse 14. The angel touches Daniel 3 times to comfort and to reassure him that God is with him. Revelation of what is written in the book of truth, 11 to 12, 4, compared with 7 to 10. Includes a brief account of the historical events from the time of Cyrus the Great to Antiochus IV, that is 2 to 20. A lengthier description of the reign of Antiochus IV in 21 to 45. After Alexander, this was the general who became in charge. Perhaps the 3 kings of Persia, verse 2, are the successors of Cyrus, that is Cambyses, Darius I, and Xerxes. Great king of Greece, verse 3, is clearly Alexander the Great, whose empire was divided into 4 kingdoms after his sudden death in 323 BCE, verse 4. The king of the south, verse 5, is Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals whose descendants control Egypt until 30 BCE. The reign does not foster peace and welfare, only God's kingdom is always permanent. Bible only gives 2 commanders of Alexander, that is Ptolemy and Seleucids. Antiochus could be one of the commander. The dream of Jacob at Bethel, the angels ascend and descend. The aura of God resides. The same thing is with Daniel, what comforts him. Antiochus is a great Greek ruler, and like Roman Julius Caesar, is considered most aggressive ruler who had no welfare for the people. Only God's kingdom can be permanent in our lives. According to Poetic Conclusion, chapter 12, verses 1 to 3, to the revelation of what is written in the book of truth, 11, 2 to 12, 4, the great tribulation of the end time will result in the vindication of the elect of God. Michael, Israel's patron angel, will arise to assist the redemption of Israel, verse 1. Many who sleep in graves will awake to live forever, others to be given to everlasting horror. This is the resurrection, verse 2. The faithful who have stood fast during the times of persecution, they will be the ones who are promised eternal reward, that is their salvation. The new life that is described in Daniel exceeds both the metaphoric description of political restoration suggested by the text like Ezekiel 37, 1 to 14 about the dry bones, Hosea 6, 1 to 2, Psalm 80, 19 to 20, and 85, 7. Once they are free from the oppression of the 4 empires and the reign of God comes, there will be newness, for Jesus will bring new life to us. Jesus will bring us redemption. He is the Word made flesh. Faithfulness and fidelity to God are very important. A man clothed in linen swears that the time of severe persecution will last for 3.5 years. Baffled at what he hears, Daniel requests further illumination, but he is denied. In verse 8 to 10, the time of persecution extended first to 1290 days, verse 11, and then to 1335 days, verse 12. Compare it with Exodus and Genesis when Joseph dies. In verse 13, Daniel is told to go his way until the end. On this note of imminent relief from persecution, the proto-canonical text of Daniel ends. The persecution will not last forever, but those who are faithful will be rewarded. Daniel keeps the tradition. Daniel is reminded by the angel. We in the church need to be reoriented. Whenever God does not explain something to us, we need to wait patiently. Our mortal lives are but passing. God will manifest Himself in His time. Place our trust in Him. Understand Him through the liturgy of the Word and the liturgy of the Eucharist. Relive what we have heard and proclaim God through our lives. The second books end here. The third part is the Greek part, where Daniel chapter 13 verse 1 to chapter 14 verse 42. The third section of the book of Daniel is a collection of 3 edifying deuterocanonical short stories about Daniel. First is about Susanna, chapter 13 verses 1 to 64, then Bel, chapter 14 verses 1 to 22, and the dragon, chapter 14 verses 23 to 42. They teach that faithfulness triumphs over adversary and that foreign powers can be convinced of the sovereignty of the Lord. Daniel chapter 13 verses 1 to 63, Susanna's virtues. Chapter 13 is a test of Susanna's courage and loyalty to the law in the face of false accusation, as well as display of Daniel's wisdom and cleverness in solving what is sometimes called one of the earliest detective stories. Susanna, it is better for me to fall into your power without guilt than to sin before the Lord. Verse 23. Susanna protects her innocence to the Lord. That is verse 42 to 43, and her prayer is heard. Daniel comes to her rescue. Under a mastic tree, under an oak tree. According to the law, Deuteronomy 19 verses 16 to 21, they must suffer the fate they planned for the one falsely accused. Verse 60 to 62, and there is joy in the family. Daniel becomes famous among his people. Daniel 14 verses 1 to 42, the Bell and the Dragon. The two brief detective stories that ridiculed idolatry appear in chapter 14 in the first. Verse 1 to 22, Daniel convinces Cyrus that the Babylonian god Bel does not consume the sacrifices that are daily offered to him. By putting ashes on the sanctuary floor, Daniel proves to the king that the priests and their families enter through the secret trap door and take the sacrificial food for themselves. In the second story, verses 23 to 42, Daniel convinces the king that the great dragon is a worthless god. By feeding the animal pitch, fat and hair, Daniel causes it to burst and die. Angered, they have lost their priest, Bel, and now their dragon. The people of Babylon demand that they be allowed to throw Daniel into the den of lions. Compare it with verse 31, compare it with verse 6. Daniel is unharmed and the prophet Habakkuk ministers to him. The seventh day, the king finds Daniel is in good health, praises the God of Daniel, and orders those who sought Daniel's death to be put into the lion's den, and they are devoured quickly. Daniel's wisdom is once again proven and rewarded, and a foreign power convinces of the sovereignty of the God Yahweh. We can compare the book of Daniel chapter 12 to 1 Peter. The time of end and these end days in verse 20. When shall these things be? To prophets search to know. Resurrection and resurrection. Incorruptible inheritance verses 2 and 13. Whereas inheritance incorruptible verses 3 and 5. Not near in Daniel's time, not to themselves but to us. When the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all these things will be fulfilled. Daniel 12:7. Salvation ready to be revealed, end of all things has drawn near. Verse 1, 4 and 4, 7 and 17. Daniel 12 and Matthew 13. Time of the end, verse 4, and time of the end. Resurrection in verse 2 and harvest in verse 39 and 40. When the righteous shine, then the righteous will shine as the sun. Salvation of those in the book. Verse 1. Salvation of those in the book. Revelation 20 verse 10. When the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all these things shall be fulfilled. Daniel 12 verse 7. The book of Daniel is also unsealed in the revelation to John and carries us forward to the last scenes of the earth's history. You read Revelation in connection with Daniel and you will be learning many things.